morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Dr. Unathi, your host. Welcome back to our show here, Dr. M Health Corner. It's a Saturday, 11 a.m. MST, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's 7 p.m. in the southern part of Africa. CAT, welcome. I see people are coming on. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, thank you. I hope you had a wonderful week. Mine was a little rocky in the beginning, but you know what? I recouped, as you know, last week. I was a little sick with some viral bug here, but I'm good. I'm 100%. Thank you so much. And please let me know if you can hear us. Drop a comment here. Let us know where you're tuning from. I'll be happy to hear that. Again, welcome. We have a big community here. We have LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook chat. Facebook community. Thank you so much, fam. Please let me know where you are tuning from. Today, as you can see, we are bringing part 2 of our last week's discussion, and it's based on the conversation we had last week with you. So I'm bringing in all these great minds so that we can chat and get to know more of what we were discussing last week. Without wasting our time, I'm going to let Unathi, who was here, you saw her, she's going to give you a brief account of herself. And then after her, please go ahead, Sima. And then I'm going to introduce Dr. Mpindu. Go ahead, Gamma.
Thank you so much, Gamma. Hello to you and to my fellow guests and also to your family. It's good to be back. We had a great conversation last week. And as a child raised by the village, it always gives me a great pleasure to be, in a community where we can discuss such hearty issues and just gather together and to build each other up. And I'm glad to be here. My name is Unathi, as I said. I'm born and bred in South Africa. I'm the author of a memoir titled Wawa Was Here, which was published 6 months ago. We started our conversation last week based on that book, actually, and the themes that we were dissecting there. I'm also a recording artist. I'm a Rhodes University graduate. I do work, in South Africa as well, in the nonprofit sector. And yeah, that's a brief summary of who I am, but I'm much more than that.
Absolutely.
And I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Gamma. Sima, go ahead, sis.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Seema Shayla, and thank you for having me, Dr. Unathi, and my fellow guests and the whole big family at large. I had the pleasure of listening to you two last week, and as you could see in the comments, that I was fired up, and that African story, I think it's many, it's many African, it represents so many of us, and I could hear and I could see myself as well. And just today I was thinking that until that African child learns to speak and use their voice, I think that sometimes the story always glorifies the village. So I'm here to speak, I guess, to share my story. And I believe that I haven't told that story, and it's already told by Unathi, and I'm just here to cheer her up. And I am a social worker. I'm a mother of 3. I'm a mental health therapist. I'm a consultant. I do wear many creative hats, but for the purposes of today's talk, I'll just leave that introduction short like that. So thank you for having me. I can't wait to dive in.
Yes, thank you so much, ladies. I'm so excited. You know, you said it all, Sima. Truly, an African child needs to say and also share his or her story, because I think our stories have been shared by so many people outside who we are, and it's either it's undertold or it's oversaid. So I'm glad to have these African children in front of you, family. And before I dwell on that, I want to actually introduce our guest here, whom I see now as my big brother, my father. That's what Shayla did when she introduced me to him. I honor him, and I can't thank him enough for taking time from his busy schedule. And he said, I'll do it. So I'm so honored to introduce to you guys Dr. Francis Munangi Mpindu. He is a native from Zimbabwe, and of course, we are all here in Canada. I'm gonna quickly do just justice, a little bit of what you're gonna hear about him, and he's gonna share his story. He's got his mouth here. Dr. Francis Munangi Mpindu is the author of the successful book Community Policing: The Path to Healthier Relationships, a police chaplain's perspective, which invites the community and the police into a journey of discovering one another and creating a new culture of relating to each other in healthier ways. This book is now being used in the teaching sector, actually, police foundations by various colleges and universities, and endorsed as a required reading by police organizations for officers and chaplains. Dr. Mpindu is a graduate of Harare Theological College in Harare, obviously, Zimbabwe, Daystar University in Nairobi, Prairie College, Three Hills in Alberta here in Canada, Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia in Canada, University of Ottawa, and St. Paul University in Ottawa, York University in Toronto, and the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where he earned a PhD in humanities, in philosophy and ethics, basically. His professional training also includes certified alternative dispute and conflict resolution. He uses mediation and negotiations. He's a certified life coach, certified workplace fairness analysis, certified grief edu therapy. Basically focuses on emotional wellness, what we're about here today, narrative trauma therapy, and decolonial processes. He has had numerous opportunities to work with and equip different leaders in various contexts around the world, including the Philippines, Jamaica, South Africa, Botswana, India, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Canada's First Nations in Alberta, Northern Saskatchewan, and Northern Ontario. He has a wealth of experience drawing from his over 20 years of being in senior leadership and management positions in different workplaces, including not for profit organizations. Amongst his other involvements in the community, Dr. Mpindu serves on various boards of organizations and is a chaplain with York Regional Police for 18 years, and a police and community relations consultant with police jurisdictions globally. In his spare time, he loves to play and watch football, which is soccer in our southern part of Africa or in the African or European context, and listens to new country music. He also takes delight in learning about different cultures and their languages and eating different foods. He says, eating is natural. What you eat is cultural. Welcome, Dr. Mpindu. I'm so excited to have you here. How are you?
Thank you very much. I feel very, very honored to be part of this gathering today. And to my fellow panelists, thank you for welcoming me. You know, when I was listening to you, I'm like, who is she talking about? I feel very honored to be here. So thank you so much for your kind words. Ngiyabonga kakhulu, ndinotenda zvikuru.
I love it. Thank you so much, Doc. You know what? Family, we're gonna kick off. Last week we talked about raised by the village. By village. Unathi took us on a route where she said how she was raised, how she discovered that the parents that she assumed or she knew all her life were her parents were not her parents. And of course, she's gonna share a bit of that. Today, though, I want us to focus on something deeper. You know, as African, fortunately, here we come from the African continent where we see culturally a child born to a couple that is not married automatically assumes her identity or his identity to be the mother's side. So that's the main purpose of this discussion and how it affects that child in the long run, or how her story or her life trajectory goes on. So I'm going to ask Unathi here, give us a short clip of what you experienced as a child and how that affected you right today and in your decision making.
Oh, thank you, Gam. Well, I'm going to start from the earlier chapters in my book where I share how I got to be introduced to my natural father, who was a young man at the time, who had this child that I am with a young girl who was still school going at the time that she fell pregnant. So how I was introduced to my biological father was via the grapevine. I did not know that he was my father until such a time that my peers that I was playing with at the time when we were kids whispered to me that this man was my father. So there was no formal introduction to me from my family in my early childhood years to my biological father. He was a stranger to me because I was pretty much being raised from the maternal side of the family by my natural mother's aunt. And how that affected me meant that he became a stranger to me, his family as well, as much as we all existed in the same village, in the same community. I knew of him. I had, of course, met him, just like everybody else that we coexist with in that context. But I did not relate to him as my father. So when I later had fleeting moments of bumping into him or just seeing him somewhere, it was a very tense exchange because I did not regard him fondly as my father. He was a stranger to me. And this is because I was being raised in a family where I already had a set of parents that was raising me as part of that village that raises the child. So I was raised in such a manner that I was in that family. I had siblings there that I, also considered to be my actual siblings until I discovered a bit later that they too, were not my siblings. So it was a very confusing time to me as a child. I was loved, embraced. I was spoiled. I was the kind of a child that you didn't mess with because I was so. My mother was so embracing of me and overly protective, and then my father as well, in his quietness, loved me through action, and I knew that I was loved, that I was accepted within this family. So it was challenging to have to come to terms with the fact that I had another father besides this father who was raising me. And it pretty much informed my relationship with my biological father's side of the family as well, because I did not know them. His family was also, estranged from me, because I did not regard them as my actual family. Even after I was informed, Gama, that I was actually related to these people, it was not easy to accept it, because I think I'm going to speculate here. I think that psychologically, the child in me just couldn't make sense of how these people that live elsewhere, that I've never really had any, close interaction with, except that they would come to the shop where I was being raised, owned by my parents who were raising me, to buy something, and I would see them in that context, just like all the other villagers that I was interacting with, who would come to the shop. So it wasn't even a matter of, here comes somebody that I'm related to, therefore I'm going to interact with them in that manner. It was just a matter of, here's another person from my village who has come to buy salt, have the transaction with them. Even in the later years when I would be the one serving them from behind the counter, it was not an encounter of love and familial ties. It was just Unathi serving these people. So this is how it affected me. And it also went well into my adult years, because I would then meet my biological father in certain settings, even outside of our village, and I couldn't regard him as my father. I knew, I was conscious. I had the intellectual knowledge that he was my father, but emotionally and otherwise, I had no connection whatsoever to him. And this is pretty much the state of the relationship that I still have with him. Very distant, I say in the book, we're strangers bound by blood. And this is the nature of the relationship that we actually have or don't have, because we don't really have a relationship. So this is how things unfolded in my case, and I know, as you've mentioned, Gama, it's prevalent in the African culture. And
Yes.
I'm going to bring it to South Africa because this is the context I'm most familiar with. Within the Xhosa culture specifically, if I am to to bring it to that even microcultural level, that in our culture, if a girl child falls pregnant outside of wedlock, the child, the baby that they bear becomes a child of the maternal side of the family. And this poses challenges for the child in terms of the sense of identity, because you don't really have a relationship with the paternal side. And you said that that's going to be the the gist of our discussion today, how
Yes.
that estrangement from the paternal side of the family affects this child. What are the implications for their sense of identity as they grow older? So
Wow.
yes, that's how I was affected, Gama, and I'm now about to be 41, and it
Wow.
still affects me today.
Gamma, you said a lot of things, and we're going to unpack each one of them. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Sima,
Gama.
thank you so much. Shayla, I would like you to chip in, sis. Last week you were so enthusiastic. I loved your interaction. This is your time now to share with the world, people who missed that, how you're being raised by your grandparents affected you. And I know that you love those two. And I know that you love Mama too. But I would like you to share with us here. How did it all turn out? And also, maybe you could share, how did you become a social worker? I see a link right there.
Right. I always say I'm my grandmother's child. I am her and she's me. She is the mother who carried me in her heart. She may have not carried me biologically, but she carried me in my heart. I was 6 months old when I was placed in the village care of my grandparents, and I literally raised in a village, for sure, village in the south, in the rural part of Gwanda in Zimbabwe. Um, and yes, so by default, I was raised also in the maternal side of the family, and the maternal side of the family decided that they wanted nothing to do with my paternal side of the family, because my mom was a teenager, and I think I would like to assume that that was somewhat disgraceful for them. They were leaders in the community, they were teachers, my grandparents were. And so their 19-year-old girl who was supposed to be and who was intelligent, who was supposed to pass in school, came back bearing me. So I was named Smangele, which means we are surprised. And I always tell the story that I doubt that that was a pleasant surprise, for sure. It's not the result that they were looking for. So I was raised by my grandparents, for sure. And then talking about my dad, so my mom would visit. I remember I used to fantasize about when she was gonna visit. It was not predictable. She would come sometimes, and um, I went to a boarding school too, like Unathi. So sometimes she would come visit me during visiting days, but most of the times it was my grandparents. So I always had that yearning to be with my mother. I knew she was my mom, but I got to call my grandparents mom and dad. I called her sister because everybody else around me called her sister. I called my uncles malumes, but my grandparents were mom and dad, the mom and dad that I knew. So
Yes.
uh, when it comes to my father, he was a taboo topic. So it's a topic that um, I would hear in the village. There were rumors about who he was. I knew I was in Dube, but Dube from where, I had no clue. So I had this yearning and this void in me to know who he was. And how that unfolded was that it came to the point that any older man who showed an interest in me, I would hope and wonder if he is that dad that I don't know about, that nobody talks about. So I always wondered who he was, and I would also fantasize and dream that one day he would choose me because in my own way of understanding, there was a part of me, because that story was not told. I made my own conclusions. I made my own meaning. Could it be that he didn't choose me? Could it be that he could have tried and fought for me, or whatever the story was? Because that story wasn't told. Nobody talked about him. And how I got to meet him. I was in boarding school when I was 12 years old. And without any mental preparation whatsoever, this man shows up in my boarding school. I get called to the visiting tree. We had a tree where our families came. And I was told, and he introduced me, he introduced himself as my dad. And so this child who has a wound, who has a void of wanting to meet her dad. So obviously I was happy that, oh, finally my dream comes true. But I had so many questions which nobody talk to me about. It's not like I could go back to my grandparents and say, guess what? My dad came to see me. I couldn't talk about that. I couldn't even talk to him. I even couldn't even talk to my mom about it. It was a topic that was not discussed. So it became my own little secret. He would write me letters and I would write him back. But I was the one chasing him more than he was chasing me. Because even after that visit, it's not like he became a part of me. I would go visit him. He was living in South Africa then, and I would wonder when he would come back. But at least that part of the puzzle got fixed in the fact that I could now put a face to that fantasy or mystery dad, who he was, right? At least I got to know that he lives and he exists somewhere. So how did all of this affect me? I started dating when I was younger. I had a void. I had a void of not having. My grandfather was there, but he wasn't my dad. He was my grandfather. So in me, there was a wound of wanting to wanting to have a father. And I want to tell the story that not only was my biological father not there, after my mom went back to school, she remarried and had my stepdad, who also did not, in my view, did not step forward or claim me as his child. So in my world, I see two men who are supposed to love me, and they are not. They are not choosing me. So I just became this child that has a wound, that just wants a male person who can choose them. And that I think I may have, my answer to that may have been, yeah, dating when I was 13. And even in my romantic relationships, although I didn't know this, because I do believe that when we have some emotional abandonment, we do develop what we call adaptive behaviors. And that could have been the answer for me to search for that love elsewhere. And as you know, that in our African parenting, you barely get told that you are loved. Yes, we see that and we may know that we are loved, but it hits different when you meet that boy who tells you that they love you, and you don't even have a dad who has modeled to you what that should look like. So that wound you carry with you. And I say that I may have been raised, I was raised with love. Like I said, there were teachers, they were active in the community. My grandmother was, she's still alive. She has a lot of love to give. But just because I was raised with love did not protect me from the inner child wounds that I carry. And from my end, it's I think I'm bearing both the father wound and the mother wound combined together. Because yes, I had my grandparents who were my mom and dad, but deep down I knew that the secure base that comes from having your mom and dad raise you, and me being in a boarding school watching other children being visited by their mothers and fathers, or sometimes it was just the mom or the dad, and me not having both of that really left some wounds that I was unconscious about or didn't know about until I had my own behaviors manifesting in different areas. And then I realized I was really the people pleasing person who wanted to be seen, wanting to be heard. And I was involved in every single area, whether it's singing. And I do realize that it wasn't just my personality. I think there was a part of me that wants to shine somewhere. And we may call those attention seeking behaviors. But for me, I think it was connection seeking, that I want to be accepted just about everybody, because the two people who brought me into this world, that was a wound that was missing, and I found ways to fill those gaps. So I think that is part of my story. I think it's really an unfolding story, but that is part of the story. I think you're muted, Dr. Unathi. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Shayla. Thank you so much. You got me into tears because I have a similar story. I met my dad at 14, but that's not about that today. Dr. Mpindu, you said you have a similar story. How did you get to the other side? I would like to hear from you as a man. How did your childhood affect you? Or please share your story. How did it mold who you are today? We look up to you. How did that come about?
You know what? Listening to these two precious young women share their story is just moving. And again, I would like to just reiterate, I'm so grateful that you, Dr. Unathi, you have created space for people to share, and they can share comfortably without fear of being ridiculed, schooled, belittled, just to share their story. So I just want to say thank you so much for creating such a space for us. Let me mention one thing again before I get to share my story. and I think this sort of applies to everybody here. Last week, when I had the privilege and opportunity to listen to the other Unathi's story, I was really moved in so many ways, in a positive way. And then when I looked at some of the comments that were, coming up, I just wanted to say this, and I'm not saying this to, no, I cannot start by being negative. I'm sharing this from the perspective of building us up. So when you hear a story like that and it touches you, and we make comments like, oh, poor child, we're basically pushing them back where they came from and where they're trying to come from. So let's not do that. I know that we're coming from a culture where we don't handle our emotions very well. In fact, we are taught, boys don't cry and don't be a sissy, because expressing of emotions is supposed to be left to the women. And so guys don't do that. So when a guy is moved and he's like, I'm just bawling right now, they're like, what's wrong with you? So we miss an opportunity to build each other up. So I just wanted to make this clear to everybody. Let's listen with the ears of our hearts. So if someone is sharing a story, don't correct them. Don't feel pity for them. Don't express pity to them. Express understanding by simply saying, thank you for sharing this story. Or you might even say, that must have been difficult for you to share. See, every culture has good and bad things in it. And what we're doing now in conflict resolution, we call this a difficult conversation. Now, a difficult conversation has three aspects. Number one, the facts about what really happened is all meshed up. And sometimes it doesn't even make sense, but it happened. So that's how complicated it is. The second thing, it impacts our emotions. Emotions are high because there's emotional investment. I mean, you listen to, one of our daughters here saying she heard from the grapevine that is your dad. That's painful. It impacts your emotions, And then we hear from our other daughter who says, listen, I know I was raised in a very loving environment, but they were not my parents. I mean, it impacts us emotionally. And then the other thing, which is really the big one, difficult conversations are tied up in our identity. Identity is huge. If you want to mess up with anybody, the reason why people fight and the reason why people yell and call each other names is because you have interfered with my identity. It's huge. You see big guys throwing fist punches and stuff like that. Identity. You see a mother taking off her clothes and leaving herself in her birthday suit. She is angry because of identity. So we don't mess with that. So I'm just saying this so that we can create this platform that really seeks to help us move forward. And so on that note, let's listen with the ears of our hearts. I was born and raised in the city in Harare. My mom, who had been working in the city, after they connected with my dad was old school, so he believed that she has to go up in the country. So she was sent all the way to Zaka, a city girl who didn't know how to fetch water, who didn't know how to pick up sticks to make firewood. Now she's out there, she has to live there. Long story short, the relationship just got more complicated. So mom leaves because my dad became very abusive, verbally and physically, and you name it. And mom couldn't take it anymore. She got up one morning. I have a young brother. There were three of us. My little brother died when he was very young. And he has a very special place in my heart. His name was Take Shore. So my next little brother, Amos, who is 2 years younger than me, mom picked both of us. And he picked a few of her clothes and put them in a paper bag as if she was going somewhere. She got on the bus and took off. That's all she had. So when she left, I had no recollection of what my dad looked like. Mom would talk about where we might find him, and she would say, I hope that you guys, one of these days, you will look for your dad. And I'm like, yeah, right, But fast forward, when I was 20, I went to look for my dad. And when I found him, here's this good-looking guy. Actually, it was a very interesting story because when I got to the place where he wasn't working that day. So they told me, oh, we know where he lives. So I went to the place and my cousin was there. My cousin brother was there. And he said, oh, yeah, this is it. Oh, man, you look so much like your dad. And, for once I'm like, oh, really? I wonder what he looks like. Because we had no communication, nothing with him. And so my cousin says, when he comes into the house, we're going to do a trick on him. So he walks in and my cousin gives me the nod and says, that's him. And there were other people who were sharing this house. And so he walks in and then, he greets everybody. Oh, hi. And then he says, oh, this is my friend from the city, from Harare, who is visiting me this weekend. So, oh, okay. So we exchange words, and I sat down and, within a few minutes, I was overwhelmed with emotion and I started to cry. And my cousin started to cry. And my dad looks at both of us and he's like, what is going on here? And then my cousin says, this is your son. And what transpired that day is still very, very vivid in my mind because my dad got up. He was seated, he got up and he put his hands in his pocket and he started pacing around and saying, I knew you would come and look for me. I don't have a child who stays in the forest and doesn't come back home. And he just kept repeating these words as he was just pacing around in the room. I felt like getting up and punching the lights out of him, but I knew that would be inappropriate. That was the only reaction I got from my dad. He never said anything until he passed away in 2009. By the way, when he passed away, we were good friends. We developed such a great relationship. Every time I went to Zimbabwe, I would buy my dad a suit, a pair of shoes, a shirt, a necktie. Out in the rural areas, if he was going somewhere, my dad would take out his suits and air them out before he would decide which one he was going to wear. So we became very good friends. Anyway, fast forward again. So I met him when I was 20. I went to look for him. And I'm so grateful that my mother always spoke positively about my dad and saying, you need to connect with your dad. So my mother is really my number one hero. And she died in 2003. So that has created gaps already. But I was able to come to terms with myself and realize that forgiveness is a one-way street. I don't wait for the other person to say, please forgive me before I can forgive them. And so I had to deal with that. I knew I had to deal with that. I didn't want to look at my dad and have all my gears, and strip all my gears in anger and whatever. So anyway, let me stop there so that others can contribute. But this was my story in terms of how I grew up. So let me just mention this in closing. One of the most painful things for me was because I did my primary education with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who then always referred to me as Munangi. So when people refer to me as Mpindu, Mpindu is my mom's side of the name. They gave me birth certificates so that I would go to school. But I have adopted the Munangi, which doesn't appear anywhere on my documents, but that's my real name. So my grandma always referred to me as Munangi, and I was proud of that. But then the problem is when I went to school, people would then say, but you're not really Mpindu, are you? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And then they're like, where's your dad? And I have no idea where he was. That was painful. That was painful. Anyway, that's part of my journey there. So emotional wellness is something that's very dear to my heart. And thank you again for creating a platform like this for us to dialogue.
Dr. Mpindu, where do I start? You guys said so many things that today we see in practice. You see it in your practice. Shayla, you see it in your practice. Unathi, you wrote about it in your book. Let's talk about the identity you guys shared about, because today we see this in the parenting. When there's been that friction between two parents who decide to split either by choice or by pain, we see it a lot in practice. And a lot of times parents don't realize this when there's parental alienation syndrome. When you start speaking ill of the other parent to your child, I am so grateful, Dr. Mpindu, your mom never said such about your dad. Today, we hear of parents referring to their exes as that dog. There's children who know their fathers or their mothers as such names. And the wounding, on top of, you just mentioned that there's already a wound. Shayla mentioned it already. You are not growing with those two parents. That's a grief and loss. And I would like Dr. Bindi to say much about that part of grief. When we think of grief, we always think of death or loss of a job. And yet, loss of a relationship that never existed is grief. You know what, Unathi? Gama, you mentioned something powerful last week. How this nearly made you date a cousin because of these names. Because us in our culture, we are very inclined, into the clan names and all that stuff. But this nearly actually affected you emotionally. Do you want to share that story? Because I want parents here to see the deeper on the danger of not knowing our father's side or our mother's side, how these things could impact us romantically, emotionally, and otherwise. I would like you to share that story because it was powerful. And there's many people who share such.
Sure, Gam. Um, Gosh, the plot thickens in terms of that story and how it is that I almost got into a serious relationship with my cousin, who is actually my uncle, if you were to, in biological terms. But because I was raised in the manner that I was raised, I've always regarded him now as a cousin. But yes, he's just 2 years older than me. But yes, he's my uncle. And it was a very innocent kind of relationship, just kids who had a, what shall I call it? I can't even term it a relationship, Gama, because that's not what it was. You know how kids get into these very, innocent interactions, and then you realize that there's something there. And this started in our early years, primary school years. And then I'm going to revert back to saying that he's my he's my cousin because I'm more comfortable, with that title. And then he left our village to go to the city because I had been going to school with him. Then he left for a couple of years. When he returned, I was in high school. I was attending boarding school, but I had come back home for the holidays, and he had also returned from the city. So we had just become sort of reintroduced to each other. And I was now this girl who had this new English kind of accent, because I was now attending this boarding school with the white kids. It's a Model C school in South Africa, so I was a different girl to the one that he had known prior to this time. And to cut the long story short, he was trying to have a proper relationship with me at this stage. And he came to visit me at home, initiated the whole thing. And we got into a point where he was approaching me. We're in the same room. He's approaching me. Something's about to happen. And I'm the one who actually stopped it and said, I hear that we are related. And he was trying to push back on that as well, because he wanted to have a relationship with me. He wanted to get into this moment. And somehow he retreated after I insisted that we couldn't go any further. So this could have been a proper relationship between the two of us. And it's only later that he got to have a relationship with his father, who I relate to as an uncle, but he's actually a grandfather. And at that stage, they did not have a father-son relationship. So I didn't regard him as family. And these are the kinds of complications that we come across in these situations. And we've spoken about this, myself and my cousin, and we've sort of hashed it out. And I said to him, I'm not the sort of person who likes for things to be swept under the carpet. So let's address this. Do you remember that this is what almost happened? And he was almost, embarrassed about the whole thing, although it's not his fault. But it really almost became a serious relationship between these kids who are blood relatives. So it's a real thing, Gama, that I think that parents ought to be, very intentional about, to tell their children who they are related to, because these things happen. We've heard similar stories, and some people end up even marrying their siblings unawares, because these things are not spoken about. You're not told who you are related to. So yes, a very important point to make.
That hit hard. That hit hard. And
Yes.
truly, we do see that. I mean, we've seen even fathers actually
Mm.
having intimate relationships with their daughters because they don't know that this
Yes.
child is his or was his. You know what, Shayla, I would like you to share with us here in the work you do, because you see little kids, and I know that we are in this side of the world. I don't know if you see this also in the other cultures, because I do see it. But what I've noticed in my own practice, in this side of the world, it's very paramount. Parents make sure that a child assumes her or his father's last name, which is very foreign to us as Africans. What do you see in your practice, and what can you advise parents here? And also, probably you want to take a deep delve on how emotionally, how these, I mean, you shared your own story, how these things play out emotionally as the child grows up.
Right. I I want to go back though, just to add on to what Unathi said. The part that I missed, that I haven't told on my dad's side, is that he had 11 children. So I'm one of the 11, and I've never met any. I've met one of the 11th, and one of my sisters was sexually attracted to my uncle, who is my father's brother, because they had never been introduced. So for sure, until they both showed up to visit my dad, and they look at each other like, hey, are we related? So these things do happen. So I know that's not the question that you asked, but I just wanted to thicken that theme as well, that it does happen, and it can be something else. What do I see in my practice? From this part of the world, I think blended families are common. You see children who are raised. What I see here is that unlike our African ways of parenting, where I feel like there's a lot of secrets in the family. For instance, I was a child born out of wedlock. I am known that it's a well-known thing that I have my father, but it's not talked about. It's only whispered by the adults, and the child doesn't get to know anything. I think what's important is that, even from an African perspective, I do think that my grandparents, when I share the story that he had 11 children, perhaps they had a good reason to want to protect me from that. But I think it would have been helpful to sit me down as I grow older to explain that you are here because of this, and wonder about, yes, this is the decision that is perhaps at the best interest of the child, but you're not involving me in it. So how is it at my best interest when I have no clue what is happening? Nobody seems to be concerned about how I feel, how I am developing. So every developmental stage has its own needs, and when those needs are not met, we in turn develop those adaptive behaviors that I talked about. So I think the missing piece, it's not the decisions that we make from a cultural perspective, but it's involving that child and trying to talk to them at the development, to meet their developmental needs at that point. If I'm 5, talk to me in a language that I'm understanding. Show me pictures. Your dad, we don't know where your dad is, but this is him, right? So that I'm not dreaming and fantasizing and thinking that every man is my father, right? And going back to your question, I see I'm going back and forth, but yes, those blended families, you see single parents, I see a lot of the parent alienation is very, very common, where even the courts, sometimes I feel they can be biased, and sometimes they contribute to those inner child wounds that we're talking about, where a child only gets to be with a parent that perhaps affords to pay the court to have the child in their care. And then that child, who may not have the money to represent themselves, then gets to see the child, whether it's on holidays, and sometimes it's at the discretion of the other parent. And I have seen where a child is actually told that the parents can speak ill of their parents. So in my work, I do try to, I always say best practice, I want to hear from both parents. And I in most cases, when we look at the legal side of the things, we often want consent from both parents when you're working with a child. So I hear both stories. And sometimes you don't get to do that because you already have a parent who has put their foot down, and they tell you, well, the dad's not even in the birth certificate, and so therefore it's as good as he doesn't exist. And in those cases, there's not much you can do but you can work with the child and help them parent themselves, because there's really that parental wound that is there when that parent is not there, and it works against them when you have a parent who is. I've also heard some parents say, well, he doesn't need a dad. I'm both his mom and dad. But in reality, a child, especially a boy child, needs his father. And every child needs both of their parents. And I wish that parents understand that, because you will have children who have so many behaviors, and some will have the what you call they fantasize, and they have these imaginary friends, or imaginary dads, or do what I did. They start dating at an early age, and even when they find themselves in them, and most in the unhealthy relationships, they cling on to that because they are nursing the wound. They are not in that relationship because of love. They are feeling a void. And when you're in a relationship because you are feeling a void, chances are you will still cling on. And when that relationship is not healthy, and as we grow, there is no bell that says, hey, you're an adult now. We continue with those inner wounds. We become just wounded adults. We wounded children in adult bodies, and that manifests in different ways in our romantic relationships, in our professional relationships, and we form insecure attachments in different ways, because our personal lives will always mirror other parts of our relationship. We may be able to hide it to some degree, but in most cases it just manifests unconsciously. And for me, I am that high achieving person, and that high achiever is really an inner child wound archetype. I think the holistic psychologist wrote about that at length, about how those adaptive behaviors. And for me, it's just being high achieving, and sometimes I don't know when to stop. So when you put together the people pleasing and the high achieving and the caregiver, you want to help everybody, you have a hard time saying no, there's usually a wound. And in most cases, it is that childhood wound that needs nursing, that we need to go back and reparent ourselves. And I hope that answers your question. I know I was just all over the place.
You were not all over the place. You did so well describing these wounds, Shayla, because a lot of times, I think all of us, when most of the times parents, they coming from that place of protection, or sometimes their own wounds. Sometimes there's this saying, we repeat history. You were mentioning that you started dating at 13. So obviously, you were repeating your mother's history here because she was a teen. So that is the biggest thing we see that keeps recurring. Thank you, sis, for sharing that. You nailed it. Thank you. Dr. Mpindu, I would love to hear from a man's perspective, not necessarily your personal story. Do you think today, what we see, more especially in our African perspective, and actually even in this side of the world, the fatherlessness, is it contributing to the gender-based violence? Is it contributing to the mental health we see in men? Any link there?
Most definitely. You're right on the money, because if you see the violence, say domestic or relational violence, most of it is actually targeted toward women. It's the men who are doing something to the women. That to me signals the fact that society has failed to equip our little boys how to treat women and how to respect them. We see this reflected in society when we look at issues between the police and our young men. We have raised young men, be it in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ghana, England, Canada, the US. Our young men don't know how to respect authority. We have failed. We have failed to invest in our young people, to help them to understand that life has structures. Life has rules and regulations. Yes, you want your freedom. Freedom is not the ability to do what you want. Freedom is to choose the right thing. That is a free person who chooses to do the right thing and say, okay, my girlfriend is making this thing or is doing this thing. By the way, nobody makes you angry. You make yourself angry. Nobody makes you feel insignificant. You make yourself insignificant. You make yourself feel insignificant. Some people might contribute, but they don't make you. It's the internal voice, it's the voices that I'm telling myself that really contribute to who I am. Remember, I said earlier that it's all tied up in our identity. What do I tell myself when I'm speaking to a girlfriend who I believe is disrespecting me? Can I tell myself, hey, listen, babe, I know you don't understand this, but when you say that, it really hurts me. Please don't say that. And I don't have to resort to violence to make a statement. I can use words. So one of the things I tell our young people is if you run out of words, study the dictionary. Take a dictionary, improve your vocabulary, use words, don't use violence. Because when you resort to violence, it's because you ran out of words. So learn to speak. And we have created a culture of young people who don't talk. They come sit in a corner and we let them do that. You see, every home has a culture. Every workplace has a culture. Every organization has a culture. And culture is created over a period of time. So this is why, going back to the contribution from these two, professional women, we have, I should say, three, including yourself, Dr. Unathi. We need to learn to borrow some concepts from other culture that will help our own African cultures to become better. Remember, I said that every culture has good and bad things in it. If something happens in our culture, for us to not talk about it, as Sim said earlier, it's not because people are not talking. You see, you can be passive aggressive, remember? You can be quiet, but making a lot of noise. You're not saying anything, but boy, you are acting it out and you're like making a big mess. So there are so many similarities, and I really feel that what you're touching on this platform is something I'm just hoping we need to find a way to make other people hear about it. Because you know what? Culture is dynamic. We need to borrow from other cultures, because we need to say, you see, for example, Shayla would know this, Sima. Oftentimes, children's aid societies, they say we have the interest of the child, which is good, but it's incomplete. It's not just the interest of the child. This child has a community. This child has parents. You have to engage them. You can't just single. You see, that's a very colonial way of looking at life. You target an individual and deal with the individual. Come into my office and I will talk to you. There's room for that. But you exist in a community. So we need to understand this child who grew up without a father, how do they feel? The families, the uncles and the grandpas and the grandmas, they were also affected. How do they feel? Nobody asks them. We don't talk to the child. We don't talk to the parents. Word gets around in the community. You get rumors and you hear rumors, people talking about your situation, but nobody's talking about it. Imagine Dr. Unathi, if we created environments in our rural areas where people can come together to talk, that's where you need qualified facilitators. That's where you need qualified mediators who will come and say, we have a purpose here. We want to come together to create a safe environment for people to share their stories. Let's hear one another. I think that could be transformational, because for us to, for example, I mean, I have 3 daughters myself, and I have opened up to my daughters and I apologize to them. When I was growing up, none of my uncles would ever say, I'm sorry for what I did. And they don't understand, in not apologizing, they're teaching our young people not to value apology and taking responsibility. So that's where we say, let the blames begin. Now we start blaming other people and we keep blaming and blaming, but it doesn't take us anywhere. So I really think that, again, I know I'm all over the map here, but what you are doing is needed, and we need this desperately. So please, please, please keep up the good work, and let's continue these conversations, creating safe environments where people can come and share their stories without anybody saying, I think you're lying. No, that's not the truth. No, that's not the truth. No, let them share their story as they see it. And as we do that, it's going to impact healing. Let me say this in closing. Emotional wellness is something you have to do something about it. If someone is hurt emotionally, it doesn't get better with the years. You have to do something about it. So for you to say, that's where we use those cliches that are really meaningless. Oh, it'll get better. Oh, no, you'll find another dad. No, you'll find another, somebody else will marry you. That's not the last person in the world. Somebody else will look at you and think you're pretty. No, you're pretty anyway. So don't worry about it. Those cliches don't work. Emotional hurt, grief, significant losses, we need to swallow our pride and say, let's do something about it and address it. This is why, if you don't address it, many of us, because of our emotional dysfunction and unwellness, we are reproducing that, and we are hurting our kids more, and our kids will hurt their own kids. So we need to unpack this.
Wow. I wish we had more time. And just to summarize everything you said here, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your wisdom. I just want to actually share with the family here. We didn't even have a chance to actually talk about how even mental health struggles manifest in children as young as 3 years old. Shayla would agree with me. She has patients or clients that have depression at the age of 3. It even gets worse when you start seeing your child misbehaving, uncooperative, even leaving school. We have dropouts today because of these wounds people are carrying around. And also the truth we don't want to speak to our children, the things they deserve to know because of how we bring all the culture. And I'm respectful of our culture, but how does it ruin, or how does it injure, how does it wound us in the long term? All these decisions are made, I honestly think they are made out of emotions, and a lot of times there's shame attached to all these things. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of guilt, but no one considers what would happen in the future of this child and what replication this child would have in the future. So I would have loved to stay longer with these people here. I'm enjoying these conversations, and it hit so hard because I kind of have a similar story. I met my dad when I was 14. He's a lovely man. And when I look back, really, it would have been nice to have known this man, but I was never given that opportunity. Many of us have such stories. It has affected how we choose our partners, how we parent, how we show up to our workplaces, how we show up to our friends. Many people, people would say she's clingy, he's clingy. Shayla touched on the part that people, you start searching for all these unanswered issues you've had from your childhood. You heard our speakers here talk about how you become this child in an adult body. It is our responsibility, guys, to retell our stories, to heal from those stories. They touched on all these things that I always talk about: wounds or seeds of pain. They never get buried, they chip up in all the areas of our lives. Many people today, they have failed marriages, failed in parenting, failed in their workplaces because of these wounds we never heal from. It is our responsibility. Now, today, we can't blame our parents. It is our responsibility to reparent ourselves, to seek the help we need. And I know that in our African perspective or cultures, we don't talk about mental health. And I feel embarrassed to say, in my 16 years of my career, I have never really treated more than 5 or 10 Black people with mental health in the 5 years I was practicing in South Africa. There's a problem right there. There's a problem right there. So we need to normalize these conversations. And thank you so much to our guests here. I would have loved to speak more. Unathi, do you want to share just little nuggets before we close here? Because I really want to stay longer, but we can't. And then, of course, Shayla, and of course, Dr. Mpindu, and then we can close. I want to stay longer.
Thank you, Dr. Unathi. Thank you, Kama. I think I'm going to speak to conversations and the importance thereof. Dr. Mpindu mentioned the importance of, gathering to have these important conversations in rural communities, for example, because it's all well and good that we meet, in these nice virtual, spaces, or even air-conditioned venues that are, where we can have the in-person conversations. But I think the spaces where we need to have these are in areas that are often forgotten, and places where mental health, as you say, is taboo, Dr. Unathi. And I think it's so important that we take these conversations to those places. And that's, to me, that is my passion as a village child who was literally raised in a village, by the village. And I think it's so imperative that we continue to talk. We must talk, because that's where our healing comes from. And also, I'm also going to borrow once again from Dr. Mpindu in terms of broadening our vocabulary so that we can be able to express ourselves through writing, through speaking, so that we don't have to resort to violence, so that we don't have to be toxic, so that we can also know ourselves and be familiar, with our own emotions, and not be scared of sitting in your room by yourself and just figuring out, what is it that I'm really grappling with here? Because issues of identity will present in other areas of our lives if unattended to. So I'm so glad that we've had this opportunity, Dr. Unathi, and I hope that we will inspire even more conversations beyond here with your family, here on your page and beyond on other platforms as well. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad that I got to be a part of this forum.
Thank you so much, Kama. Bless you.
All
Shayla,
right.
do you want to say something, please?
Yeah. I feel inclined to talk about the secure base. I think that from an attachment perspective, the parents of the child are meant to be this secure base. And so when we don't have that secure base, or when the village has cracks, that child grows to see the world through those cracked or broken lenses. So I think it's important that in our building that secure base, we do include the child, no matter how young they are. Because I know that even from a grief perspective, I don't know about other countries or other cultures, but I know in our Ndebele culture, you don't discuss grief with the child. I heard that you whisper to them when they are sleeping or something, and that's supposed to be enough. Even though they may have grown with that person who is now deceased, that should be enough. Or so we do need to have those conversations and revisits part of our culture that no longer serve us, not just stick to it because it's culture. And lastly, going back to until the hunter learns to write. Every story will glorify the, what does it say? Until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. I think it goes back to our stories too, that the child needs to tell that story. And when we tell our stories in ways that make us stronger, it's important to realize that grief and gratitude can coexist in the same manner that I said I'm grateful for my grandparents. I'm grateful for the nurturing village that I was raised in. But that doesn't mean that I don't have wounds. So those two dualities can coexist without one taking away from the other. And so even if my grandparents were to sit in here, they would hear that I'm still grateful, but I'm also still wounded, and I'll continue to heal those wounds. And yes, when we are wounded, we chase from our wounds, and as we heal, we do choose from our worth. And those are my last words. So thank you for this opportunity, and it's so important to tell our stories.
I'm so blessed. I am so blessed to know you guys. Dr. Mpindu.
Thank you so much. I just want to piggyback on the two, um, younger ladies. Well, I'm saying that because I'm much older, so I feel comfortable saying that. We are all professionals. We're all professionals, and I have high respect for them. I liked the emphasis on the community. And let me just tell you something. I happened to check something on Sima's page, and so I'm going to use that in closing. Um, Oftentimes, yes, there's this phrase that, you know, being raised by the village, in the village, and we glorify the village, and rightly so. But let's not forget the child. The child has stories, just as Sima has mentioned. So on her site, she talked about, let's keep things equalized. Let's equalize things here. Sure, the village has raised the child, but the child is a child, and the child has their own way of looking at how they were raised. Let's give them an opportunity to talk. Let's create a safe environment for the child to talk, so that children are not just being seen, but they are being heard. And I think the more we create opportunities like that, I think we are contributing to a better society. And so, again, let's keep on keeping on. Keep up the good work, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Doc. To our family, thank you. This has come to an end. I don't want to end it. You know me, when we're having fun, I do not want to end. And of course, I'm thinking we probably might have part 3. I'll talk with the panel. Thank you for staying with us. Next week, come back, same time. We have these conversations because for me, this is our healing space. It's safe, like you had. I always tell you, in this page, there's no stupid question. Let's respect each other. Let's be all those adults that respect each other and heal from each other's stories. Maybe now you have an opportunity to start sharing your own story. All of us have been wounded in one way or another. But what I know for sure, gratitude, love, and kindness, they build us, they bond us. Let's go out there and be loving to each other. This year, I'll leave you with this. This year, I've taught myself these 2 words, grace and compassion. I'm at that point, I'm in that journey where I understand the most yuckiest things people say or do, because I think all of us deserve grace and kindness. That's all I'm gonna leave you with. Go out there and be loving. Thank you so much. Love you all. We're gonna come back here next week. I love my guests. I would love to bring them back. And you know what, you guys, drop topics you want us to talk about. I love taking those deep delves on those difficult conversations we are not used to talking about openly. These are the initiations to going deeper, to go for our healing individual journeys. So drop the topics you want to talk about here. I'm going to bring all these great minds. You know me, I'll bring them all. Thank you so much, guys. I love you all. Please come back again. You are not guests, by the way. You are family now. You're part of this.